Hello viewers, welcome to week 4, lecture 3 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about Russian formalism, their views towards narrative, especially structure of prose narrative, right? So, like in the previous lecture, I talked about Russian formalism and their overall approach towards prose narratives. There we talked about various elements, various devices which go into the making of the novel and how defamiliarization in prose fiction is achieved with the help of plot construction, thematics and various motifs which are used in a novel. Right. We also understood that how in poetry, Russian formalists are not very much concerned about meaning, but in prose fiction, of course, they are concerned with meaning as well, because thematics is related to that. In this lecture, let us talk about story and plot distinction in detail or about their relationship in detail, right? So, we find that how the method that Russian formalists used to lyric poem, they are using similar methods to the structure of novel as well, right? For example, they say that lyric is a static kind of medium in respect of its object. It is instantaneous, it is graspable as a single unity. But so far as a prose narrative is concerned, it is different. It is not spontaneous. You cannot grasp it as a single unity. It is, spanning over a period of time, over chapters, over long, narratives, right? So, in this way, they find that in a novel, what you find a kind of commitment to narrative. In it, there is a movement in and outside the time. It is dynamic and active entity in that way, right? So, we find that how this poetics of fiction that these Russian formalists have evolved, it has impacted structuralist criticism, right? So, lyric is a static object and institution, and how it can be seen in terms of associative devices, in context of vertical relationship among various devices. But so far as a novel is concerned, it can be seen as an investment in temporality, right? So, in a novel, things are moving in a horizontal way, right, in a horizontal mode, not in a vertical mode. So, if in poetry we find that it is concerned, a lyric is concerned with associative devices, here we find that how prose fiction or a novel or the structure of a novel is concerned with syntagmatic devices in which there is a contiguity, right. So, they say that in a novel sequence is important, passage of time is important, there is no pre-existing material to defamiliarize, right. So, in this way, we find that how Russian formalists are, the way they are talking about the structure of the novel, they want to make this point that form and content are inseparable. The content of the novel is subsumed in the form of the novel, right. So, if we understand the form properly, naturally content and other related things to it will be obvious to the readers. And they say that each novel is different, its content is different. So, every time a writer has to reinvent its form, right. The most important discussion of the Russian formalist is this distinction between story and plot. Story is called fabula, plot is called sujet in Russia, right. So, making this distinction between story and plot, they say that story is basic succession of events. Story is raw material out of which a plot is constructed, and the way a plot is constructed, the artistry lies in that, literariness lies in that, right. They are saying, delineating the relationship between plot and story, that the way a plot is made, it defamiliarizes the story. It makes the familiar story strange, right? So further, they say that this form, the structuring of a plot has a formative role on character, dialogue, content, everything. He goes on to say that hero of a story can be said to be a function of the plot and is created by it. Right. So, plot is an artful disposition of the incidents which make up the story. Further, story refers to the overall narrative, including the characters, setting, themes. It encompasses everything that happens in the narrative, including the emotional and thematic elements, while plot refers specifically to the sequence of events and actions that occur within the story. It outlines how the story unfolds and the causal relationship between events. For example, a plot is about cause-effect relationship between various events. For example, Shlovatsky says that Hamlet is created by the technique of the stage, right? So, character is not given importance over language or the form of literature. For example, we talk about Greek tragedies. There we find that how the plot of Greek tragedies are based on various stories, right? So, Aristotle in his Poetics, in his chapter 6, he talks about plot or mythos and he calls it arrangement of incidents. He calls it a logical arrangement of incidents, which are calculated to have a kind of emotional impact on the readers. However, Russian formalists are different from Aristotle in their delineation of plot. For example, if we want to understand this distinction between story and plot, we can look at the example of Oedipus the King, a great tragedy written by Sophocles. So, let us see what is the story of Oedipus and how a plot is constructed out of that story. So far as the story of Oedipus is concerned, in story we find that how events about the life of Oedipus are, told in a linear way. For example, it starts with the beginning, that how Oedipus was born, to the king and queen of Thebes, who are Laius and Jocasta, right? Before Oedipus is born, Laius and Jocasta, they are aware of a prophecy which has said that if a boy is born to you, he will be destined to kill the father and marry with the mother. So, they are Laius and Jocasta, they are already aware of this prophecy. So, when Oedipus is born, what they say that they give Oedipus to a shepherd because they know that the child is bound to have a disastrous future here or relationship with them. So, the child is given to a shepherd and they say that you can do whatever you want to do with this child, we want to get rid of this. However, the shepherd takes or shows mercy on that small newborn infant and he takes that child to the neighboring state where he hands over the child to another shepherd, right? And that Corinthian shepherd from the state of Corinth, he takes that small child or that infant to the king and queen of Corinth, that is Polybus and Merope. Because Polybus and Merope, they are not having their issue, so they adopt the child, they bring up the child as their own. So whenever, when Oedipus grows old, one day in a carnivalistic gathering with his friends, somebody calls him a bastard and the person tells him that you are bound to kill your father and marry your mother. Oedipus is very upset by hearing this thing from that stranger in that party. So next day he goes to the oracle of Delphi and there he inquires that is it true about me? The oracle confirms that it is true. You are bound to kill your father and marry your own mother. In this way, Oedipus is very disturbed and he decides to leave that kingdom of Corinth because he does not want to commit that sin which has been prophesied by the oracle of Delphi. So in this way, he leaves that place, he goes to another kingdom, and unconsciously he is moving towards the kingdom of Thebes, where there is a place called Davila, where three roads meet. There he meets a procession, an entourage of supposedly a king. You know, there is a conflict between Oedipus and the members of that entourage, and there is a fight among them, and Oedipus kills the person who was sitting in that procession, who was the head of that procession, and many members of that procession. In this way, you know, the charioteer and the master of that procession, they are killed. When he moves ahead, he meets a sphinx. Sphinx poses certain questions to him, and he answers those questions. Sphinx dies. So people of that state thinks that he is a great man because he has saved that state of Thebes from the gloomy and terrible shadow of Sphinx, and you know, they declare him to be the king of that state. When Oedipus goes to that state, he finds that the king is already dead, so he marries the queen and he starts living in the kingdom of Thebes peacefully. After certain days, you find that how the state is plagued by various natural calamities, famine, drought, and then you know, the entire state is plagued. Oedipus is very troubled, and then he calls Tiresias, who is a visionary, who can look into the future, the blind Tiresias, and he asks Tiresias that what is the cause of all these calamities in my kingdom. Tiresias tells him that, you know, don't try to inquire the question, you will be in trouble. But, you know, Oedipus is relentless about knowing the truth, discovering the truth. And ultimately he comes to know that he is the plague spot of his own kingdom. Why? Because he has killed his own father, he has married his own mother. And in this, he has violated the sanctity of not only statehood, but also of the family. And in this way, Oedipus, you know, comes to know this. Then when he comes to know this, Jocasta also comes to know this. She commits suicide, and Oedipus blinds himself, and he self-exiles himself from the kingdom. So this is the story of, we can say, Oedipus, the king. But if we look at the plot, if we look at the drama that Sophocles has written, we find that how the plot starts with the middle of the story. So here you find that the order of story is disrupted. What is the middle of the story? It is made the beginning of the plot, where the drama opens with Oedipus very troubled because his state is plagued. He summons Tiresias and whatever ensues. So this is a plot, how plot is aesthetically constructed by disrupting the order of the story, right? So in this way, this relationship is there, and in mostly we find that in plots, in many classical plots, how the middle of the story is chosen. For example, Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneas is talking about, you know, the fall of Troy to Dido. So that is also in the middle of the story. Similarly, in Milton's Paradise Lost, where Raphael is relating to the war in heaven to Adam and Eve in paradise. So that is something in the middle of the story, right? So here we find that, you know, how formalists had a more revolutionary concept of plot than Aristotle. For them, plot is not simply this arrangement or rearrangement of story incidents, but they are also saying that how in a plot, devices are used to interrupt and delay the narration. And the best example is given by Tristram Shandy, that how in Tristram Shandy there are various digressions, typographical games, displacement of parts of the book, where you find that usually what we find in the order of a book. There's a preface, then dedication, introduction, and the rest of the book. But what you find in Tristram Shandy, the structure is disrupted. Preface comes in the middle of the story. Acknowledgement comes towards the end. The story starts from somewhere in the middle. So this complete disruption. Here we find that it is not only relationship between plot and story. The structure of the novel draws attention towards the construction of the plot itself. How plot is constructed, right? So there the novel is not concerned with telling the story of Tristram's life. Rather, the novel seems to be concerned with its own making, how various devices have gone into the making of that novel. So here we find that how plot is violation of expected formal arrangement of incidents. And in this way, for example, I'd like to read out some part from Tristan Shandy's, or to take an example from Tristan Shandy. The hero's father and his uncle are engaged in a conversation. The father wonders, what is all that noise and running backward and forward for? And the uncle begins to reply. But in the meantime, the hero intervenes to say that in order to understand his uncle's opinion on the matter, the reader must know something about his character. And then there is a digression on the character of Uncle Toby, running into no less than 36 pages. And finally, when the uncle reverts to the matter and the reader waits with bated breath for what he has to say, he blurts out an answer as simplistic as, I think, replied he, it would be not amiss, brother, if we rung the bell. So here we find that how the order of narrative is disrupted, another narrative has been inserted, and somehow we find that the two things are not very much related to each other. So this is the way we find that how the structure itself makes any ongoing story extremely defamiliarized. It leaves it extremely strange, right? And in this way, artistry lies in that. So in this way, we find that how Russian formalists, they are talking about self-reflexive prose fiction. What happens in a self-reflecting prose fiction? That how it frustrates the familiar plot arrangement, right? So how Sterne makes plotting a literary object. There, the story is not a literary object. Plot is not a literary object, but plotting itself is a literary object. How this transformation of this story into plot, it is, very remarkable here. It is a novel not about any character. It is a novel not about any socio-political condition. It is a novel not about the psychology or biography of a character, but it is a novel about its own making. And in this way, this self-reflexive prose fiction, or drawing attention of readers towards this fact, that is remarkable. In another way, Slovatsky is very different from Aristotle or Aristotelian concept of plot. For example, Aristotle considers plot as an organic unity, right? Because of, for example, when Aristotle is talking about various elements of drama, so he says that plot or action, thought, then action, character, thought, diction, spectacle, and music. That is the order. So here we find that action comes at the beginning, plot is everything. He says that a drama can exist without a character, but cannot exist without a plot. So the supremacy of action, the supremacy of plot, the way Aristotle, stabilizes it, then we find that how for him diction or language or form, it comes at the fourth number. But for Slovatsky, form is more important, right? So that is one thing. Second thing, that for Aristotle, a plot is something that is always making some human point. It is always giving some essential truths about human life, right? He says that a plot should be plausible. It should be having certain inevitability, right? But so far as formalists are concerned, for them, a plot is not concerned with giving any essential truth about human life, right? So for formalists, plot is simply a tool of defamiliarization. It prevents us from regarding the incidents as typical and familiar. Slovatsky on his landmark essay on the theory of prose, he talks about suppression of naturalistic motivation in the novel, right? For example, what is this suppression of naturalistic motivation in the novel. So Śliwowski says that what is called naturalistic or what is called naturalization, we'll be talking about that, right? So he says that what a plot does, it resists naturalization. For example, in our life, or suppose we are reading a book, we find that on pages there are images which are randomly related to each other. There we find that how there is a disrupted continuity in the narration. There we find that how order has been reversed. So we find that, oh, these things are not normal. We try to naturalize it. We try to, end that randomness or that random relationship among images. We always try to impose an order on that. We always try to bring disordered things into an order, right? So this is how we try to naturalize things. We think that the way these things have been created, perhaps some disordered minded person has created it. So let us impose an order on that. And in this way, we try to always make things familiar. So that is what an artist has not to do, according to Russian formalist, according to Śliwowski, according to Thomas Wesky, that a writer has to make it defamiliarized. We should resist this naturalization as we find in Tristram Shandy. And this is what Russian formalists are doing. And in this way, these Russian formalists are anticipating structuralist as well as post-structuralist thought. Later on in the chapter on Mikhail Bakhtin, we will be talking about centrifugal forces. There we find that how, a writer like Bakhtin is more interested in disorder in life. How centrifugal forces, if they are there in life, let them be like that. Their unification, their ordering should not be attempted, right? For example, Śliwowski does not reduce the bizarre disorder of Tristram Shandy to an expression of Tristram's quirky mind, drew attention to the novel's insistent literariness which resists naturalization. So we have already talked about laying bare, how the technique is laid bare, how art should not conceal its own processes. So that is what they say that, how the artistry lies in resisting this naturalization, and it is related to this construction of plot. Motivation is another concept that Russian formalists use. So they say that smallest unit of a plot is motive. It can be taken as a single statement or action, right? We have already talked about bound motive or free motive, right? So free motive, though they are inessential, but it is the focus of art. For example, formalists say that when Raphael is related this war in heaven to Adam and Eve, he is using it as a free motive. But this free motive is something that allows Milton to insert narrative in his work of art, right? So this is important, and in this way it reverses the subordination of formal elements to content. Like in classical narratives, what we find that formal elements are subordinated to the content, while here we find that how content is subordinated to the formal devices. And talking about free motives, they say that whenever we are talking about a work of art, we are talking about various ideas and themes which are related to a work of art or which are embodied in a work of art. Usually we think that it should refer to an external reality. A work of art should have life-likeness. A work of art has no meaning if it does not refer to some external reality. So it is bound to reflect that. However, these free motives are various excuses for reflecting that reality. But however, they are saying that this dependence on external non-literary assumption is called motivation. And so far as Tristram Shandy is concerned, it is quite free of such motivations. Therefore, Tristram Shandy is a unique and typical kind of novel, and it is without motivation. There is no help of extra literary devices or devices which are external to it. It is constructed purely by formal devices which are bared in the novel. In this lecture, we have talked about the story and plot in detail, what is motivation in novel, and how all these devices make a prose narrative self-reflexive. In this way, you know how these Russian formalists are anticipating avant-garde movements or structuralist and post-structuralist thoughts. We'll be talking more about their legacy towards the end of this unit. And with this, I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you.